Hi everyone. I'm very sorry that you can't see my face, but I think like my face isn't as interesting as the presentation content, or hopefully the presentation content is more interesting than my face. Let's do it that way around. I'm here to talk a little bit about technical SEO for JavaScript developers, and I realize that this title is probably a little misleading because I am here to talk to you all about how you can work with your JavaScript developers and understand what your JavaScript developers are doing if you are working with JavaScript websites. So today I would like to address three things, as I only have a limited amount of time and I want to get as many Q&A in as possible because I think that's where it's more interesting, because that's the things that you are encountering and you are wondering about. So I would like to give you some Q&A time. First things first, we will have to understand how Googlebot processes websites, and that's all websites, not necessarily only JavaScript websites, to then figure out why JavaScript matters for you as an SEO and for your search engine optimization efforts in general. And then I would like to go through some very broad general steps on how you should go about troubleshooting what you think is a JavaScript issue. And I'll give you some pointers as well, because as I said, I only have half an hour in total, so I would like to give you some basic pointers, but then you can take these pointers and maybe work with your developers or try to better understand how these tools work, and then use them to adapt them to your specific circumstances and websites that you're dealing with. Cool. So how does Googlebot process websites? Well, there's this infamous diagram that I at some point drew for an I/O presentation. I think I drew this for the I/O presentation last year. It has since made it into various videos as well as the documentation. Very fundamentally, we are starting under, I'm not sure, can you see my mouse cursor actually? I'm not sure if you can. If you can't, that's fine. We start on the top left corner, we start in the crawl queue. So we found a URL somewhere, and we take this URL and we make an HTTP request to it. This is where the Googlebot comes in, really, because that's when you, in your server logs, you see Googlebot has made a request. So we make an HTTP request, we get some content back. If this is a website, we get some HTML back. And then we process that. What does that processing mean? Processing isn't really a step in the actual Googlebot pipeline. It is really just a simplification of a bunch of stuff that happens. For instance, we are looking for links in the HTML to put these linked URLs into the crawler queue so that the crawler can fetch them in the future. We also look into things like the canonical. Here we look at the canonical in multiple stages, but this is one of the stages where we look at the canonical that you tell us to look for. We look at meta robots, we look at the X robots tag header to see if you want us to follow links or if you want us to index the page and stuff like that. We look at a bunch of signals coming from the initial HTML, but we also enqueue it, and that's, again, all websites get enqueued for rendering, and then we render the page. That means we open it in, fundamentally, you can imagine it, the server opens a Chrome tab with your page and then waits for the page to finish, and then takes an HTML screenshot, more or less, from that, what has been created in the Chrome tab, and then looks at it in processing again. So again, we are looking for links. Again, we are looking for robots, meta tags and headers, and all that kind of stuff happens again. And then we put the result into the index. And if you want to understand how JavaScript has impact on SEO and how JavaScript websites work in terms of search engine processing, then you really need to understand this step. So while this looks relatively simple, I don't think it's well understood by many, and that's perfectly fine. You should not have to worry too much about it, but I think it makes sense to understand what's going on in there to get a better understanding of where things could potentially go wrong or how JavaScript influences things. Which brings us to our second point, more or less, like what happens in rendering is this. Pretty much, we got the HTML from crawling. So that's that, great. But then the HTML might load a bunch of more assets, like JavaScript files, images, videos, linked documents in iframes, CSS files, all that kind of stuff is basically an asset. So the crawler has to go again and fetch these assets as well. And then we can start parsing the HTML. We can start trying to understand what the page is made of, right? Because at this point, HTML, what it really is just a bunch of text. Now, computers are relatively good at understanding text, but this is not just normal text, this is text that describes a website. And now we need to actually parse and understand this description to figure out what is this website made out of, right? What are the headings? What are the links? What are the I don't know, accordions, the images on this page, all that kind of stuff that needs to be parsed. The first step is that you parse it into a DOM, the document object model. You can imagine this to be like a tree that contains everything that is in your HTML. So each HTML element is a node or is a leaf in this tree. And then we have the body on the top, or the head and the body are on the top. And then everything that is within them is below that. So like you have an H1 maybe, and then maybe you have a paragraph. And in the paragraph, you might have an image and so on and so forth. But this is not what we actually use in the search engine parsing. What we then use is, once we have the DOM, we basically try to figure out what is the rendered HTML. That's not even 100% accurate. What we technically use is the rendered tree, but you can imagine it as the HTML that is in the page once everything has done loading. What does that mean? What does that mean, loading? Well, as I said, like the HTML comes from the crawler initially, then we load all the assets. By the way, they are using a crawler, which means robots.txt can potentially immediately start breaking rendering when you do not allow us to render assets that we need to create. The DOM tree. The DOM tree contains not just the HTML information, but everything that happened while JavaScript was executing. So the rendered HTML is actually influenced by JavaScript. That's why JavaScript does have an impact on SEO. Specifically, JavaScript can directly interact with the DOM. So once you load a piece of JavaScript, and be that from inside the HTML or from an external JavaScript file that is linked in the HTML, JavaScript has full access to the DOM. It can pretty much influence anything that happens on the website, and thus influences the rendered HTML that we are looking at. So the HTML that your server sends is just the starting point. But there's this intermediate phase where this HTML that you see when you do view source, you see the initial HTML that comes from your server. That might not be the HTML that we actually see in the rendered HTML once we are ready for indexing. How does that work? Well, JavaScript can add content to it. So you can add things into your HTML that hasn't been there beforehand. A typical example is client-side rendering, where you are basically just having an empty HTML skeleton, and then you use JavaScript to get anything that you need to actually start creating the content that we see on the page. It can remove things. You can remove all sorts of tags. You can remove content. You can remove images. You can change things around. You can change the text entirely. You can inject links. You can do all sorts of stuff in JavaScript because you have direct and full access to the document object model that way. You can also load additional assets. A very obvious example would be if you are, again, doing client-side rendering, you might load additional content that wasn't in the initial HTML skeleton. This can come from providers like, I don't know, reviews that come from an external platform, or comments that come from an external platform. It can be lazy loaded images. You can hypothetically have JavaScript kick in to load images as the user navigates through the page, and more images become visible in the browser window. And that also has an impact on page performance. Notice that I'm saying impact, not negative impact, nor positive impact, because it depends. JavaScript is a tool that has basically like full rights to anything on the page. It can do everything at once on your website. That's why you should trust your JavaScript to a certain degree. And this means that it can have positive impact. Like if you install a service worker, that's a piece of JavaScript that allows your website to be smarter about how to use the network and also actually work offline. So that makes the website work offline, which it wouldn't without JavaScript. That's a positive impact on page performance if your users are offline. It also is positive when it does, let's say, the lazy loading approach to things. It may reduce the amount of images that are loaded in one go and only loads images as they are about to become visible. So then the website is usually faster to actually display to the user, and that is positive impact. On the other hand, if it heavily changes the content all the time and relies on lots of more network requests to be made, it can also make your website a lot slower. And if it breaks, or if it cannot be downloaded because of, I don't know, robots.txt or caching issues, or your server going down or something like that, then it can also happen that this actually breaks the page entirely or makes it very, very slow. So be a little careful on how you use JavaScript. It is not inherently good or bad. It is a tool that can be used either way. It can also add things that you just don't have without it. Like, as I said, the offline functionality is one thing. You can have a very dynamic application that you wouldn't have. I've seen people do like 3D tours of apartments and offices in the browser. You can't do that without JavaScript. Google Docs would be impossible without JavaScript to the extent that we have it. Google Mail has a bunch of functionality that is super nice and would not work without JavaScript. Chatbots usually use JavaScript to actually do the navigation and not the navigation, the interaction and the network traffic part of things. So like you can add a lot of cool stuff to your website thanks to JavaScript, but you should do this responsibly because JavaScript kind of has quotes unquote admin access to everything on your page. So you want to make sure that you understand what's going on there. And how do you actually then troubleshoot this? How do you go about figuring out if things go wrong? Usually you see somewhere that something is off. A page is not indexed, a page is canonicalized where it shouldn't be canonicalized. You're seeing errors in the Search Console reports. You get like reports from someone saying like, this page doesn't show up in search, these kind of things. And then usually the response seems to be, or the instinct for many people seems to be to just jump to the conclusion there is JavaScript on the website, so it must be JavaScript that is the problem. Oftentimes it is not, but it's seemingly hard to distinguish. And then a few people are using interesting tools to like come to a conclusion. So as I said, for instance, a bunch of people say like, oh, we have a problem with our React or Angular or Vue.js website because if I inspect URL, I'm not seeing any of the content. Well, the thing is, if you say that, then you are looking at the initial HTML coming from the browser. From the server into the browser. You're not seeing what actually has been created in rendering, so you're looking at the wrong spot. Another thing seems to be to look into cache. What is the cached URL in Google? Turns out cache is quite an old feature and does not necessarily, and oftentimes actually does not just simply reflect what we are seeing after rendering. The cache oftentimes is taken before we even render from, again, the initial HTML rather than the rendered results. The cache feature isn't that well maintained, so it's a convenience function. It's not a debug tool. But what can you do then? Well, we do have a bunch of testing tools. One is the URL inspection tool inside Search Console, where you can test the live URL, and you can also check what is the actual content that we have in the index by clicking on View Crawled Page. So if you click on View Crawled Page, the side panel pops up, and there are three things: the HTML, the screenshot, and more information. The screenshot is nice, but it's only an approximation of what you would see if you were opening this page in a browser. More interesting is the HTML. And there is a little magnifying glass icon where you can search for content that you think should be on the page. So you can open the page in a separate tab, look for some text maybe, or look for some HTML element that you know should be there. And then you can search for this in the rendered HTML. The HTML you see there is the actual rendered HTML, which means if there's something that is not in the HTML there, we are not seeing it. It should be here in the rendered HTML, or we are not seeing it. And if we don't see it, we can't actually index it. When I say we don't see it, I don't mean visibly see it. That's where the screenshot is not so helpful. If something is not visible in the screenshot, it doesn't mean that we are not using it for indexing. If it's in the HTML, we will potentially use it for indexing. If it's not in the HTML, we don't know it exists, so we cannot use it for indexing. Also helpful is the More Info tab that shows you all the resources that have been loaded and if there were resources that we couldn't load because of robots.txt or other errors. So definitely check these out. And that's your general first step. Like, you want to check what we say we think is going on with this page. If there's an error, that's something that you probably want to check on. If it says it's fine, it's potentially indexed, or it is in the index, then you should mostly be fine. but you can use the rendered HTML to figure out if the content that you think needs to be in our index is actually potentially being indexed by checking out if it's in the rendered HTML. But sometimes that doesn't help. Sometimes you just get an error that says like cannot be indexed because of robots.txt or something, and then you're like, why is there robots.txt? I don't understand, or what's happening, or why is this page in the index? This is an error page. Why is this a soft 404? I don't understand. In which case, I highly recommend using your browser, because browsers have these amazing developer tools, and if you use the developer tools, you quickly find things that you might not easily spot elsewhere. So for instance, I was checking out why this website was actually indexed, and I was like, this is weird. This is an error page. I mean, it clearly says, oops, so why is this being indexed? And then I had a closer look, and I found, oh, look at that. Down there in the developer tools under network, I could see that when I was opening the page, the server returned 200 OK. But this page doesn't really look like 200 OK, does it? It's definitely not OK. So optimally, this page would either return a 404 or redirect to a page that would return a 404, or it needs an additional no index just to make sure that this does not get indexed in the end. So you have a bunch of options. Use our testing tools. So the mobile-friendly test comes to mind, the rich results test comes to mind, or the URL inspection tool. And if you're not sure why we are saying something isn't the way that you think it is, definitely also check out your browser developer tools. How you reach them is a little different between the different tools. I think like some browsers put it under the F12 key. I'm not sure what Safari does. Chrome has it under the little menu icon, the 3 dots in the corner, and then more tools, and then developer tools. Or if you're using macOS, then it's hold on, what's it? Option Command I think is the tooling, and then you have these different tabs down there, like you can see here, the network tab that I'm using in the screenshot. But there are other things like sources, shows you what is basically in view source. Elements lets you explore the DOM. You can check with audits. Audits is quite helpful. Memory consumption, all that kind of stuff. Like if you know what you're doing, this is a really, really powerful tool. And there are courses out there. If you don't know what you're doing there are free courses where you can, and documentation as well, where you can learn more about these tools. And if none of that helps, then maybe, just maybe, this isn't a JavaScript problem, or not directly a JavaScript problem, in which case you should check what's happening on your site. The first thing that you can check is what is in the server logs. Is there anything weird going on? Are we getting URLs that we shouldn't be getting? Or are we being blocked by something? Or is there something happening that you didn't intend to happen? Is your server very, very slow to respond? Is it responding with the wrong status code? Is it maybe responding? I had a case where someone was like, Google doesn't show this page, but it's such an important page, but it's canonicalized away with a bunch of other pages, and these don't seem to make sense. And then we checked. It was somewhere at a conference. I'm like, did you check your server logs? And the person said, yes, let's actually check. And they found out that this page was super large on text, like there was plenty of text in there. But when you check the server logs, we found out that all these pages that were thought to be the same only contained like 100 characters. And of course, yeah, if all these unrelated pages for some reason were delivered from your server to Googlebot as an empty HTML page, then we think like, yeah, all of these pages are empty. So they are all the same page, kind of, because they are all empty. And because they are empty, they are not exactly interesting to us, so we might not put them in the index. So that wasn't a JavaScript problem. It was a server configuration problem where the server, for some reason, returned an empty HTML page for certain URLs to Googlebot, and only to Googlebot. Users were getting the actual page. Again, you can look at the rendered HTML in the testing tools, again, to make sure that it's what you think it should be. And you can check if the resources were loaded correctly. You can do that both in your server logs, if are coming from the server, as well as the testing tools that we provide. And maybe also check if there is, like, especially if you use a CDN, they might hold old versions of the code. So maybe you updated the code, but the code hasn't updated in your CDN yet. So you might run into all sorts of situations there. Now, I'm here again to listen to your questions and answer to your questions. So I would leave you with a bunch of resources that are super helpful. I hear that Bitly is apparently down right now, and we are using that to power these links, but it should come back up soonish. So then these links will work again. So we have the JavaScript SEO basics guide in our documentation. You can also find that at developers.google.com/search. We have a bunch of videos on the topic. We have a mailing list where you can report problems and other people can help you, and I can also potentially take a look at this. And we do have office hours for JavaScript SEO problems specifically, and for regular SEO problems as well, every week on youtube.com/Google Webmasters. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much and open up for questions.